Sometimes the moment that changes everything in a relationship isn't dramatic or explosive, but rather quiet and revealing in ways you never expected. I still remember that morning 3.5 years into my marriage when I finally understood exactly where I stood in my husband's life, and more importantly, where his mother believed I belonged. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was standing in my own kitchen at 7:45 making breakfast for my husband Daniel before he left for work, when I heard the familiar sound of a key turning in our front door lock. Without even looking up from the eggs I was scrambling, I knew exactly who it was because this had become our unwelcome morning routine for the past 3 years. Margaret swept into my kitchen like she owned the place, which in her mind she probably did since her son lived there. She didn't say good morning or acknowledge my presence in any way, but instead walked straight to the stove where I was cooking and physically moved me aside with her hip while reaching for the spatula in my hand. "Those eggs are going to be rubbery," she announced to the kitchen as if I wasn't standing right there watching her dump my perfectly good breakfast into the trash can. My Danny needs his protein cooked properly, not destroyed by someone who doesn't understand the basics of cooking. She cracked new eggs into the same pan I'd been using and began what had become her daily performance of showing me how a real woman takes care of a man. The thing about Daniel is that he was the youngest of 8 children and the only boy in the family, which meant he'd spent his entire life being treated like a precious prince who needed constant protection and care. When we first started dating, I thought it was sweet how his family doted on him, but I didn't understand then that doting was actually suffocating control disguised as love. His mother, Margaret, had been making every single meal for him until he was 23 years old, and when he moved out for college, she'd driven 2 hours each way every Sunday to bring him a week's worth of home-cooked meals labeled with heating instructions. Even at 18, she was still checking his teeth before bed when he visited home and laying out his clothes for the next day like he was a toddler who couldn't dress himself. When we got married, Margaret took it upon herself to train me in the proper care and feeding of her baby boy, which apparently included detailed video tutorials she'd send to my phone at all hours, showing me the correct way to fold his underwear iron, his shirts, and even organize his sock drawer. The videos always came with lengthy text messages explaining how I was failing him and how lucky I was that she was there to fix my mistakes before they caused permanent damage to her son's well-being. That particular morning, as she cooked his eggs exactly the way she'd been making them for 32 years, she kept up a running commentary about everything wrong with my kitchen. The dish towels were folded incorrectly, the spice rack was organized all wrong, and didn't I know that Danny preferred his coffee mugs on the second shelf, not the third? I stood there in my own home being lectured about where to put coffee mugs by a woman who had her own key and felt entitled to use it whenever she pleased. Daniel came downstairs adjusting his tie and walked straight past me to kiss his mother on the cheek and thank her for breakfast. He sat down at the table and began eating the eggs she'd made while she fussed over him, asking if they were seasoned properly and whether he wanted more toast. I might as well have been invisible for all the attention either of them paid to me standing there in my pajamas watching this bizarre morning ritual play out in my own home. When he finished eating, Margaret actually wiped his mouth with a napkin like he was a child and reminded him to call her at lunch so she could make sure he was eating properly. After Daniel left for work, Margaret turned her attention to me with the look of a disapproving teacher about to lecture a failing student. She pulled out a notebook from her purse and I realized with growing horror that she'd been taking notes on everything she felt I was doing wrong in my care of her son. The list was 3 pages long and included items like doesn't understand Daniel's sensitivity to synthetic fabrics and failed to notice he prefers his sandwiches cut diagonally, not straight across. She went through each item on her list explaining in detail how my failures were hurting her son and potentially damaging his future. According to her notes, I'd bought the wrong brand of laundry detergent which could irritate his sensitive skin, used the incorrect water temperature for his white shirts, and most egregiously, had been making his bed wrong, which could lead to poor sleep quality and affect his job performance. She actually had photographs on her phone showing what she considered the correct hospital corner technique versus my apparently slovenly approach to bed making. The notebook wasn't new, but I'd never seen it before that day. She explained that she'd been documenting my shortcomings since our wedding day so she could help me improve over time, but I was proving to be a slower learner than she'd hoped. She'd even created a rating system with stars next to tasks where I'd shown slight improvement though. Looking at the pages, I couldn't see many stars, just lots of red ink and disappointed comments about my lack of domestic abilities. What really got to me wasn't just the criticism or the invasion of privacy, but the way she spoke about me, like I was hired help who wasn't performing up to standard rather than her son's wife and partner. She used phrases like, "When I hired you to take care of my son and your performance review isn't going well," as if our marriage was a job I'd applied for, and she was my supervisor. She actually said at one point that she'd had higher hopes when Daniel first brought me home, but I was proving to be a disappointment in almost every area that mattered. The Saturday after the notebook incident was when things escalated to a level I couldn't have imagined. Margaret had invited us to what she called a small family gathering, which turned out to be a full reunion with over 130 relatives from Daniel's extended family. I knew some of them from our wedding, but many were distant cousins and great aunts I'd never met before, all gathered in a church social hall that Margaret had rented for the occasion. What I didn't know until we arrived was that Margaret had told everyone the gathering was partly to help support poor Daniel, whose new wife was struggling with basic household management. She'd apparently been updating the entire family through a group chat about my various failures and shortcomings. So by the time we walked in, everyone was looking at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity, like I was some sort of charity case they'd all come to help. Margaret had even set up what she called learning stations around the room where her sisters and female cousins could teach me essential skills I apparently lacked. There was an ironing station where her sister Patricia had brought several of Daniel's shirts to demonstrate proper technique. A cooking station where her cousin Linda was prepared to show me how to make Daniel's favourite pot roast, and even a laundry station with visual aids about water temperature and stain removal. The worst part was when Margaret stood up with a microphone during the welcome speech and announced to the entire room that she'd arranged this teaching opportunity because she loved her son too much to watch him suffer with inadequate care. She actually used the words inadequate care while looking directly at me as over 100 relatives nodded sympathetically. She went on to explain that she'd been coming over every morning to make sure Daniel got at least one proper meal each day since I couldn't seem to master basic scrambled eggs. Several relatives laughed at that, and I heard murmurs around the room about how patient Margaret was and how lucky I was to have such a devoted mother-in-law willing to help. Daniel sat beside me through all of this without saying a single word to defend me or even reaching over to take my hand in support. He actually nodded along when his mother mentioned the scrambled eggs, as if confirming that, yes, his wife really couldn't cook proper breakfast. After the welcome speech, Margaret's sister Patricia called me over to the ironing station where she'd set up an actual ironing board and had several of Daniel's work shirts hanging on a nearby rack. At least 20 female relatives gathered around to watch as Patricia explained that Margaret had sent her photos of how I'd been ironing Daniel's shirts, and we needed to address the problems before I ruined his entire wardrobe. She held up one of his shirts and pointed out where she claimed I'd created improper creases and how the collar wasn't crisp enough for a professional man. The demonstration took 30 minutes with Patricia going through each step while the audience offered helpful tips and shared stories about their own husband's preferences. One of Daniel's great aunts actually said that in her day, a woman who couldn't iron a proper shirt wouldn't have been allowed to marry, and several others nodded in agreement. They discussed my failures like I wasn't standing right there holding the iron Patricia had handed me while she guided my hands to show me the correct motions. When we moved to the cooking station, things got even worse. Linda had prepared ingredients for Daniel's favourite pot roast and announced that Margaret had told her I'd been trying to cook it wrong by adding vegetables Daniel didn't like. The truth was, I'd added carrots and celery because they're standard in pot roast, but apparently Daniel had decided at age 5 he didn't like cooked carrots, and his mother had never challenged this or encouraged him to try them again. Linda went through the recipe step by step while explaining that a good wife knows her husband's preferences and doesn't try to force changes on him. She actually said the words force changes about adding vegetables to a pot roast like I was some kind of domestic terrorist trying to corrupt Daniel with carrots. The gathered relatives murmured their agreement and several shared stories about how they'd learned to cook exactly what their husbands wanted without trying to introduce new things. Margaret circulated through the room during all of this, adding commentary and sharing what she called amusing anecdotes about my failures. She told the story of how I'd once bought Daniel boxer briefs instead of boxers, and he'd had to call her crying about the discomfort. The truth was he'd mentioned once that the briefs were a bit snug and I'd returned them the next day, but in Margaret's version he'd suffered terribly due to my negligence and she'd had to rush over with proper underwear to save him. She also shared how I'd tried to rearrange our living room furniture without consulting her, and Daniel had been so disoriented he couldn't relax in his own home. What actually happened was I'd moved one chair to a different corner, and Daniel had said it looked nice, but his mother had shown up the next day and insisted we move everything back because Daniel needed consistency in his environment. She'd actually used the phrase his mental health depends on stability while dragging furniture across our hardwood floors. The lowest point came during lunch when Margaret had arranged for me to sit at a special table with what she called her teaching team, which consisted of 6 of her closest female relatives who'd been assigned to mentor me in different areas. Each woman had prepared notes on their area of expertise, whether it was meal planning, laundry, household budgeting, or what they called emotional support for a sensitive man like Daniel. While everyone else enjoyed a buffet lunch, I sat through presentations from each of my mentors who'd clearly put considerable thought into their lessons. Martha, who was in charge of teaching me about emotional support, actually had a PowerPoint presentation on her tablet showing different scenarios where Daniel might need comfort and how I should respond. One slide showed what to do if he had a hard day at work, and the correct answer was apparently to call Margaret immediately so she could provide proper maternal comfort. The budgeting mentor named Carol had printed out fake bank statements and wanted to walk me through proper financial management for a household. When I mentioned that I actually handled our finances and had an MBA from Northwestern, she looked at me with pity and said that Margaret had warned her I might be defensive about my shortcomings. She continued with her lesson on how to balance a checkbook, while I sat there with my master's degree in business administration being taught basic math by a woman who kept calling me dear in that condescending way. During the meal planning session with Agnes, I finally reached my limit. She was explaining how Daniel needed his meals at specific times and how Margaret had given her a detailed schedule of his preferences when I interrupted to say that Daniel and I had our own rhythm and routine that worked for us. Agnes looked shocked that I'd spoken up and immediately called Margaret over to deal with what she termed my resistance to help. Margaret arrived at our table with several other relatives trailing behind her, curious about the disruption. When Agnes explained that I'd interrupted the meal planning lesson, Margaret's face took on an expression of deep disappointment, like a mother dealing with a rebellious teenager. She put her hand on my shoulder in what probably looked like a comforting gesture, but felt more like a restraint, and began speaking to the gathered crowd about how some young women today don't understand the importance of accepting guidance from their elders. She went on for several minutes about how her own mother-in-law had trained her properly when she married Daniel's father, and how grateful she'd been for the help, even though it was sometimes hard to accept criticism. She shared how she'd cried many nights during her first year of marriage when her mother-in-law corrected her, but now she understood it had all been for her own good and to help her become the wife her husband deserved. The relatives around us nodded and murmured their agreement while sharing their own stories of learning from older women in the family. The general consensus seemed to be that I was ungrateful and proud, and that Margaret was practically a saint for putting up with my resistance to her help. Several women patted Margaret's arm sympathetically while shooting disapproving looks in my direction, like I was a difficult child refusing to eat my vegetables. What made everything worse was that Daniel remained completely silent through all of this, sitting at another table with his male cousins, apparently oblivious to what was happening. When I looked over at him hoping for some sign of support or recognition of how inappropriate this all was, he was laughing at something his cousin said without a care in the world. It was like he'd brought me to this event and then completely checked out, leaving me to fend for myself against his mother and her army of well-meaning relatives. After lunch came what Margaret called the main event, which turned out to be a fashion show of sorts where she'd brought several outfits she'd purchased for me to model for the family. She announced that since I didn't seem to understand how to dress appropriately for a corporate executive's wife, she'd taken it upon herself to build me a proper wardrobe. The clothes she'd bought were all beige and grey conservative pieces that looked like they belonged to someone 30 years older than me. She had me try on each outfit while she provided commentary about why it was appropriate and how it would help Daniel's career for me to look more professional and less like someone trying to attract attention. The truth was, I dressed perfectly appropriately for my job in digital marketing, but Margaret had decided that my colourful blouses and modern-cut dresses were too flashy for her son's wife. She actually used the word flashy about a simple blue dress I'd worn to work the previous week. The fashion show audience offered their opinions on each outfit, with most agreeing that Margaret had excellent taste, and I should be grateful for her help. One elderly aunt commented that in her day, wives dressed to honour their husbands, not to stand out, and several others chimed in with agreement. They discussed my body like I was a mannequin, with Margaret pointing out how certain styles would hide what she called my problem areas, which were apparently any part of me that showed I was a woman under 35. By the time we reached the final outfit, which was a shapeless grey pantsuit that made me look like I was attending a funeral, I could feel tears building behind my eyes. Not from sadness, but from pure frustration and anger at being treated like a child who couldn't dress herself by a room full of people who didn't know anything about me beyond Margaret's poisonous narrative. The suit was 2 sizes too big because Margaret insisted I needed room to grow into it, which I later realised meant she expected me to gain weight once I learned to cook properly. During the closing ceremony, Margaret presented me with a binder she'd created called Daniel's Care Manual, which was apparently meant to be my guide to properly maintaining her son. The binder was 3 inches thick and divided into sections, covering everything from his dietary preferences and sleep requirements to his emotional needs and work wardrobe care. She'd laminated important pages and included photos demonstrating proper techniques for various household tasks. The assembled relatives applauded when she handed me the binder, like she was presenting me with some kind of award, rather than an insultingly detailed instruction manual for taking care of a grown man. Several women came up afterward to tell me how lucky I was to have such a dedicated mother-in-law and to share their own tips for implementing Margaret's system. One cousin actually said she wished her mother-in-law had cared enough to create such a comprehensive guide when she got married 20 years ago. The binder included daily checklists for me to complete and submit to Margaret weekly so she could track my progress. There were charts for meal planning with Daniel's approved foods highlighted in green and forbidden items in red, including several vegetables he'd decided he didn't like as a child. The laundry section had actual fabric swatches attached with notes about proper care and warnings about which items could never be washed together, even if they were the same colour. What struck me most was the section on emotional care, which read like instructions for managing a temperamental toddler rather than supporting an adult partner. There were scripts for how to respond when Daniel was upset about work, with strict instructions to validate his feelings without offering solutions because that might make him feel inadequate. The manual actually said that suggesting ways to solve problems could damage his masculine confidence and should be avoided at all costs. The drive home from the reunion was silent, except for the sound of my fingernails digging into the leather binder Margaret had given me. Daniel seemed completely unbothered by the day's events, actually humming along to the radio like we'd just come from a pleasant family gathering, rather than my complete humiliation in front of over 100 people. When I finally couldn't take the silence anymore and asked him how he could let his mother treat me that way, he seemed genuinely confused by my anger. She went to all that trouble to help you, he said, keeping his eyes on the road and not seeming to understand why I might be upset. She made a whole binder and everything. Most wives would be grateful to have that kind of support from their mother-in-law. When I pointed out that I didn't need a manual to take care of him because he was an adult man capable of basic self-care, he actually laughed and said, "That's not how our family works, sweetheart." He went on to explain that his mother had taken care of him his whole life, and it was natural for her to want to train me to do things properly now that I'd taken over that role. The phrase "taken over that role" made my stomach turn because it revealed how he saw our marriage not as a partnership between equals, but as a transfer of caretaking duties from his mother to me with detailed instructions to ensure continuity of service. When I told him I wanted his mother to stop coming over every morning, he pulled into our driveway and turned to look at me with genuine hurt in his eyes. "She's just trying to help," he said in the same tone you'd use with a child having an irrational tantrum. "You're being cruel to someone who loves us and wants what's best for our marriage. How can you be so ungrateful when she spends so much time and energy trying to make our lives better?" I tried to explain that having his mother break into our house every morning to remake breakfast wasn't helpful, but actively harmful to our relationship. But he just shook his head. "The word break-in is really harsh," he said, as if the problem was my language rather than his mother's behavior. "She has a key because she's family, and family is always welcome in our home. That's how I was raised, and I'm not going to change that just because you're feeling insecure." That night I lay in bed next to my husband, holding the care manual his mother had made and wondering how I'd ended up in this situation. I'd fallen in love with Daniel partly because he seemed so close to his family and valued those relationships, but I hadn't understood that close actually meant enmeshed, and that his mother's love came with conditions and control that extended into every aspect of our lives, including our marriage bed. According to the manual, Margaret had opinions about our intimate life too, with a section delicately titled Physical Affection Guidelines that suggested appropriate frequency and timing to avoid interfering with Daniel's work schedule or energy levels. She'd actually created a chart showing optimal days of the week based on his usual stress patterns, and warned against being too demanding of his attention when he needed to focus on his career. The manual noted that Daniel required 8 hours of sleep to function properly and included a suggested bedtime routine I should implement to help him wind down. This routine involved specific herbal tea Margaret provided preparing his clothes for the next day and something called quiet time, where I was supposed to sit silently while he processed his day without interruption, or what the manual called unwanted input from his wife. Over the next few weeks, I tried to go back to normal, but Margaret's morning invasions became even more intense after the reunion. She started bringing ingredients to cook full breakfasts from scratch, explaining that she needed to give me hands-on training since the reunion lessons didn't seem to have stuck. She'd stand behind me with her hands over mine on the spatula, physically guiding my movements while providing constant criticism about my technique. She also started staying later after Daniel left for work, going through our house and making notes about things that needed improvement. I'd find sticky notes on everything from the bathroom mirror telling me the proper way to hang towels to inside kitchen cabinets, explaining her reorganization system. She even left notes in our bedroom about how the sheets should be tucked and why my choice of curtains was affecting Daniel's sleep quality. The sticky notes weren't just suggestions, but orders written in a tone that brooked no argument. One on our refrigerator read, "Daniel's yogurt belongs on the second shelf right side. When you put it on the left, it disrupts his morning routine. Stop being careless with his needs." Another inside our closet said his work shirts should be organized by color light to dark. Your random hanging system is disrespectful to his professional image. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning 6 weeks after the reunion. I'd woken up early specifically to make breakfast before Margaret arrived, hoping to present her with a fait accompli of perfectly cooked eggs and toast. But when I heard her key in the lock at 7:45 exactly, I was still in the middle of cooking. She walked in, took one look at the stove and actually pushed me hard enough that I stumbled backward while she grabbed the spatula from my hand. "You're going to burn them," she announced, scraping the eggs into the trash with more force than necessary. "After all this time and all my help, you still can't manage something as simple as eggs. What is wrong with you that you can't learn?" Her voice had taken on a harder edge than usual, and when she turned to face me, there was something cold in her eyes that I'd never seen before despite all her previous criticisms. "I'm starting to think you're doing this on purpose," she continued, cracking new eggs into the pan. "You're deliberately cooking badly to spite me and hurt my son. No one could be this incompetent after months of training unless they were trying to fail." She went on to list every mistake she thought I'd made that week, from buying the wrong brand of coffee to folding the bathroom towels in thirds instead of halves, like her manual specified. Daniel came downstairs in the middle of her tirade, and instead of defending me or even asking his mother to lower her voice, he walked over and put his arm around her shoulders. "Don't let her upset you, Mom," he said, shooting me a disappointed look. "I know she's difficult, but we have to be patient with her. She didn't have the advantages of being raised in a family like ours, so we need to give her time to learn proper standards." The two of them stood there united against me in my own kitchen, discussing my shortcomings like I was a disappointing employee they were considering firing. Margaret actually reached up to pat Daniel's cheek and told him he was too good for his own good, putting up with such a slow learner. He smiled down at her with such genuine affection that something inside me finally snapped completely. I walked over to the stove, turned off the burner, and told them both to get out of my kitchen immediately. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a thunderclap, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Margaret's mouth fell open in shock while Daniel's face went through several expressions, starting with confusion, moving to disbelief, and settling on anger. "You can't talk to my mother that way." He said, his voice low and dangerous in a way I'd never heard before. "Apologize right now." When I stood my ground and repeated that I wanted both of them out of my kitchen immediately, Margaret began to cry. Not gentle tears, but full body sobs that shook her shoulders as she collapsed against Daniel, wailing about how she'd only ever tried to help. Daniel guided his sobbing mother to a chair and knelt beside her, whispering soothing words while shooting me looks of pure venom. "After everything she's done for you," he said, his arm around Margaret's shaking shoulders. "All the time and effort and love she's poured into helping you become a better wife. And this is how you repay her. You're heartless, absolutely heartless to treat family this way." Margaret's sobs intensified as she gasped out words between breaths about how she'd failed as a mother, raising a son who would choose such an ungrateful wife. She clutched at Daniel's shirt with both hands, saying she didn't know where she'd gone wrong, but obviously she hadn't taught him how to recognize a suitable partner. The performance was so over the top, it would have been funny if my husband wasn't buying every second of it. I went upstairs to get dressed for work, leaving them in the kitchen to their drama. When I came back down 20 minutes later, Margaret was still crying softly, while Daniel made her tea and toast, murmuring apologies for my behavior. He looked up when I entered and announced that he'd be staying home from work to take care of his mother after the trauma I'd caused. The word trauma hung in the air between us like an accusation. That evening, Daniel informed me we'd be going to counselling, but not marriage counselling. Instead, he'd found someone who specialised in helping difficult spouses learn to appreciate their families. He'd already made an appointment for the following Tuesday and expected me to take time off work to attend. When I suggested we find someone together who could help us with our actual relationship issues, he laughed bitterly. "The only issue in our relationship is your attitude toward my mother," he said, pulling out his phone to show me the therapist's website. Dr. Patricia Holmberg specializes in family integration and helping spouses understand their place in established family systems. She comes highly recommended by several people from Mum's Church who've dealt with similar problems of wives not respecting family hierarchy. I looked up Dr. Holmberg that night and discovered she ran what essentially amounted to wife training seminars disguised as therapy. Her website talked about helping women understand their roles and responsibilities in marriage, with a heavy emphasis on respecting elders and maintaining family traditions. The testimonials were all from women grateful to have learned how to properly honor their husbands' families and stop causing disruption with their selfish modern ideas. The next morning, Margaret didn't show up at 7:45. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she'd actually heard me and decided to respect our boundaries. That hope died when Daniel's oldest sister Ellen called at 8 to inform me that their mother was too devastated to leave her bed and it was entirely my fault. She spent 15 minutes lecturing me about respect and gratitude while I stood in my kitchen trying to eat breakfast. By the time I got to work, I had 6 missed calls from various members of Daniel's family, all wanting to share their disappointment in my treatment of Margaret. His sister Patricia left a voicemail saying I should be ashamed for making an elderly woman cry. Another sister Carol texted paragraphs about how Margaret had done nothing but try to help, and I was too proud to accept guidance. Even cousins I'd barely met felt compelled to reach out and share their opinions. The family phone calls continued throughout the day, making it impossible to focus on my work. My assistant kept apologizing for interrupting, but Daniel's relatives were calling the office landline when I stopped answering my cell. His Aunt Linda actually told my assistant it was a family emergency and convinced her to pull me out of a client meeting only to lecture me about disappointing Margaret. By lunch, I'd had enough and turned off all my devices. I needed space to think clearly about what was happening to my life and marriage. I walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench watching normal people go about their day while my phone buzzed uselessly in my purse. For the first time, I let myself acknowledge that my marriage was in serious trouble, and it wasn't because I couldn't cook eggs properly. When I finally turned my phone back on, there were 43 missed calls and twice as many text messages. The word ungrateful appeared in almost everyone, along with variations of disrespectful, selfish, and cruel. But buried in the middle was a message from someone unexpected, Sarah Daniels' second oldest sister, who I'd barely spoken to beyond polite greetings at family events. Her message was simple: call me when you can. We need to talk away from the others. I waited until I was back in my office with the door closed before calling her back. She answered on the first ring and immediately asked if anyone could overhear our conversation. When I assured her I was alone, she let out a long sigh and said something that changed everything. "You're not the first one she's done this to," she said quietly. "Our brother Michael was engaged before Daniel met you. Beautiful girl named Jennifer who ran her own catering business. Mum destroyed that relationship in less than 2 years with exactly the same behavior. The morning visits, the cooking criticism, the family interventions, all of it. Jennifer finally left when Mum convinced Michael she was poisoning him because she used different spices than Mum did." Sarah went on to tell me about Jennifer, who'd tried to set boundaries with Margaret, only to be painted as the villain trying to tear the family apart. The family had rallied around Margaret just like they were doing now, supporting her narrative that Jennifer was difficult and ungrateful. Michael had chosen his mother and Jennifer had walked away, but not before warning Sarah that Margaret would do the same thing to any woman who tried to marry her precious youngest son. "She's already started telling people you're mentally unstable," Sarah warned. I heard her on the phone with Aunt Linda saying you might need professional help for your anger issues. She's building a case that you're dangerous and Daniel needs protection from you. It's exactly what she did with Jennifer, except she learned from that experience and she's moving faster this time. I asked Sarah why she was telling me this when the rest of the family was firmly on Margaret's side. She was quiet for a moment before admitting she'd watched her mother destroy multiple relationships over the years, not just romantic ones, but friendships and even professional connections. Anyone who threatened Margaret's control over her children became an enemy to be eliminated by any means necessary. "I couldn't save Jennifer," Sarah said, "but maybe I can help you see what's happening before it's too late. Mum won't stop until you're gone, and Daniel is back under her complete control. The only question is whether you'll leave on your own terms or wait until she's turned everyone, including your husband, completely against you. The choice is yours, but either way, she wins in the end. That evening when I got home, Daniel was waiting in the living room with what looked like an intervention setup. His mother sat on the couch, flanked by two of his sisters, while Pastor Williams from their church occupied the armchair. They'd arranged the furniture in a semicircle with one empty chair clearly meant for me facing them like a defendant before a tribunal. "We're here because we love you," Pastor Williams began, as I reluctantly took my assigned seat. "Your family is concerned about your recent behavior, and we want to help you understand how your actions are affecting everyone, especially your husband and his mother. Sometimes when we're struggling, we can't see how our pride and stubbornness are hurting the people who care about us most." What followed was an hour of what they called loving correction, but felt more like a coordinated attack. Each person took turns explaining how my refusal to accept Margaret's help was a sign of dangerous pride and possible mental instability. They used phrases like cry for help and acting out and concerning patterns of behavior, like they'd all been reading from the same script about handling difficult women. Margaret sat there the entire time with tears rolling down her cheeks, occasionally interjecting with comments about how she just wanted to love me like a daughter, but I kept pushing her away. She'd even brought props including the binder from the reunion, which she clutched to her chest like evidence of her good intentions. Every time she spoke, Daniel would reach over to pat her hand or squeeze her shoulder in comfort. Pastor Williams suggested that I might benefit from their women's submission support group, which met every Wednesday to help wives understand biblical principles of honoring family hierarchy. He explained that many modern women struggled with accepting guidance from their elders, and the group provided a safe space to work through those prideful impulses. Several of the wives had found peace once they learned to submit to God's plan for family order. When I tried to explain my perspective, Daniel actually shushed me like a misbehaving child in church. "This isn't about your feelings," he said in that condescending tone I'd grown to hate. "This is about your behavior and how it's hurting our family. You need to listen and learn, not argue and make excuses. Mum has been nothing but patient with you, and this is how you repay her love." The intervention ended with Pastor Williams leading a prayer for my heart to be softened and my pride to be broken so I could accept the blessing of Margaret's guidance. Everyone except me bowed their heads and murmured agreement, while the pastor asked God to help me see the error of my ways before it was too late to save my marriage. The threat was barely veiled: Margaret would be welcomed and honored, or I would lose my husband. After everyone left, Daniel informed me that he'd be sleeping in the guest room until I apologized to his mother properly. A proper apology apparently meant not just words but actions, including reinstating her morning visits and following the care manual she'd created. He'd already given her a new key since I'd been selfish enough to change the locks, and expected me to welcome her back the next morning with gratitude for her patience. I spent that night alone in our bedroom, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what Sarah had told me. Jennifer had probably lain in this same bed, feeling this same crushing weight of being painted as the villain in someone else's twisted narrative. I wondered how long she'd tried to make it work, before realizing that fighting Margaret was like fighting the tide. Eventually, you'd drown no matter how strong you thought you were. The next morning, I was already dressed and drinking coffee when I heard Margaret's key in the lock at exactly 7:45. She entered with Daniel beside her, like he was her bodyguard, making sure I wouldn't cause another scene. Without a word, she went straight to the stove and began making breakfast while Daniel sat at the table, watching me with cold eyes, waiting for the apology he'd demanded. I didn't apologize. Instead, I sat there drinking my coffee while Margaret cooked and Daniel glared, and the silence stretched between us like a chasm. When she finished cooking, she set a plate in front of Daniel and one at my place, then stood behind his chair with her hands on his shoulders like she was claiming her territory. The eggs were perfect, of course cooked exactly the way she'd been making them for 32 years. Daniel ate mechanically, while Margaret rubbed his shoulders and told him about her plans for the day, which apparently included reorganizing our entire house to her specifications. She'd brought her label maker and intended to mark everything, so I couldn't claim ignorance about where things belonged. Daniel nodded along, encouraging her plans, while I sat there feeling like a ghost in my own life, invisible and irrelevant. When Daniel left for work, kissing his mother's cheek but ignoring me completely, Margaret settled in for what was clearly going to be a long day of territorial marking. She started in the kitchen, pulling everything out of cabinets and drawers, then putting it all back according to her system. She hummed through the walls. I could hear her moving through the house, the label maker clicking away as she marked her territory inch by inch. My phone buzzed with messages from work, but I couldn't focus on anything except the sound of my life being reorganized by someone who saw me as an incompetent interloper in her son's life. By the time I emerged for lunch, Margaret had transformed our home into her vision of perfection. Every surface had been cleaned and polished, every item labelled and categorized according to her system. She'd even rearranged the furniture despite my previous objections, creating what she called a more harmonious flow that would better suit Daniel's energy. The house looked like a showroom, sterile and impersonal, with no trace of my presence anywhere. "Look how much better everything is now," she said, surveying her work with obvious pride. "This is how a proper home should look, organized and efficient, with everything in its place. Daniel will be so happy when he sees what I've done for you both. You should thank me for spending my entire day fixing your mess, but I know gratitude doesn't come naturally to someone like you. The someone like you hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I wasn't just a bad wife in Margaret's eyes, I was a fundamentally inferior person who could never measure up, no matter how hard I tried. She'd already decided who I was based on some standard I could never meet, and nothing I did would change that narrative. To her, I would always be the woman who wasn't good enough for her precious son. That afternoon, while Margaret continued her hostile takeover of my home, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Sarah, who agreed to meet me for coffee the next day to share more details about what had happened with Jennifer. The second was to my best friend from college, who was a family law attorney in the city. I needed to understand my options even if I wasn't ready to use them yet. When Daniel came home that evening, he walked through the house with Margaret, admiring all her improvements. They discussed the new organization system, while I sat in the living room, watching them like a stranger observing someone else's family. Daniel praised every change his mother had made, telling her how much better everything looked, and how grateful he was for her help in creating a proper home environment. At dinner, which Margaret cooked while I was banished from my own kitchen, they discussed plans for future improvements. Margaret wanted to redecorate our bedroom because the current colours weren't conducive to proper rest. Daniel agreed immediately, saying he'd always thought my choice of deep blue walls was too stimulating. They made plans to paint everything beige the following weekend for a more calming atmosphere. After Margaret finally left, Daniel turned to me with expectation clear on his face. He was waiting for me to thank his mother for spending her day improving our home. When I remained silent, he shook his head in disgust and headed for the guest room again. At the doorway, he paused and delivered what he clearly thought was the ultimate ultimatum about our marriage. "You have 1 week to fix your attitude," he said coldly. "Either you accept my mother's help and show her the respect she deserves, or we need to have a very different conversation about our future. I won't live with someone who treats my family with such cruelty and ingratitude. The choice is yours, but I'm done watching you hurt the woman who gave me life and has done nothing but try to help you." I spent another sleepless night, but this time, instead of agonizing over the situation, I made plans. I quietly gathered important documents from around the house and stored them in my office. I made a list of items that were mine before the marriage and started researching apartments in the city. I wasn't ready to leave yet, but I wanted to be prepared if Daniel followed through on his threat. The next afternoon, I met Sarah at a coffee shop, far from their usual neighborhood haunts. She looked nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder, as if Margaret might appear at any moment. When I assured her we were safe, she relaxed slightly and began telling me the full story of what had happened with Michael's ex-fiancée, Jennifer, including details the family had tried to bury. Jennifer was wonderful, Sarah said, stirring her coffee absently. Smart, successful, independent, everything Mum couldn't stand in a woman. She ran this amazing catering company and actually tried to include Mum at first, asking for family recipes and advice, but nothing was ever good enough. Mum would show up at Jennifer's commercial kitchen and tell her employees they were doing everything wrong. The parallels to my own situation were eerie. Margaret had invaded Jennifer's workspace just like she'd invaded mine, criticizing everything and undermining her authority in front of employees. She'd convinced Michael that Jennifer's different cooking methods were wrong and possibly dangerous. She'd even called health inspectors claiming Jennifer's kitchen was unsanitary, though the surprise inspection found nothing wrong. The worst part, Sarah continued, was watching Michael change. He went from being proud of Jennifer's business to being embarrassed by it. Mum convinced him that a proper wife wouldn't need to work, especially not in food service. She said Jennifer was neglecting him by spending so much time on her career. By the end, he was parroting everything Mum said about proper wives and traditional roles. Sarah showed me old text messages Jennifer had sent her during the relationship's death spiral. The pain and confusion in those messages was heartbreaking, as Jennifer tried to understand why the man she loved had turned against her. The final message, sent the day Jennifer moved out, simply said, "I hope someday he realizes what he lost, but I can't wait around for him to choose me over his mother." "She's happy now," Sarah added quickly. "Married a great guy last year, someone who actually supports her career and doesn't have a mother from hell." She expanded her business to 3 locations and just won some big industry award. Meanwhile, Michael is 35 and still single, living 10 minutes from Mum and eating dinner at her house 4 nights a week. She got exactly what she wanted, her baby boy, all to herself. I asked Sarah why she stayed in contact with such a toxic family dynamic. She sighed and admitted it was complicated with elderly grandparents and financial entanglements, and the fact that not everyone in the family was blind to Margaret's behavior. Some of them just chose the path of least resistance, agreeing with her to avoid becoming targets themselves. It was easier to sacrifice the occasional girlfriend or daughter-in-law than stand up to Margaret's wrath. "The thing is," Sarah said as we prepared to leave, "Margaret's getting worse as she gets older. She used to be more subtle about her control, but now she's desperate, especially with Daniel. He's her last chance to keep a child completely under her thumb. The others have all created some distance, even if they won't admit it. But Daniel has always been her favorite, her baby, and she'll destroy anyone who tries to take him away." Sarah hugged me goodbye and whispered good luck before hurrying away. I sat in my car afterward thinking about Jennifer rebuilding her life and finding happiness with someone who actually valued her. It gave me hope that there was life after Margaret, even if it meant life after Daniel too. The question was whether I'd have the strength to walk away or if I'd keep fighting a battle that was rigged against me from the start. That evening I came home to find Margaret and Daniel in our bedroom with paint samples spread across the bed. They were debating between Swiss coffee and alabaster for the walls, while Margaret held fabric swatches against the window to see how they looked in natural light. Neither of them acknowledged my presence as I stood in the doorway of what was supposedly my own bedroom, watching them plan changes to my personal space. Margaret had apparently spent the day shopping for what she called bedroom essentials, including new sheets, pillows, and curtains, all in shades of beige and cream. She explained to Daniel that neutral colours promoted better sleep and would help regulate his circadian rhythms. The deep blue I'd chosen was too stimulating, she insisted, and could be contributing to what she mysteriously referred to as his recent stress, without elaborating on what that meant. Daniel held up different paint samples, asking his mother's opinion on each shade like they were choosing colours for his childhood bedroom. The intimate space I'd shared with my husband had become another territory for Margaret to claim and redesign according to her preferences. When she noticed me watching, she smiled triumphantly and announced they'd be painting that weekend, with or without my participation. I turned and walked away, leaving them to their plans. In my office, I pulled out the apartment listings I'd printed and began making calculations. With my salary, I could afford a nice one-bedroom in the city, closer to my job and far from Margaret's daily invasions. The thought of waking up in my own space without dreading the sound of a key in the lock felt like freedom I'd almost forgotten existed. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. When I opened it, my heart stopped. It was a photo of me at the coffee shop with Sarah taken from across the street. The message below read, "Having secret meetings with family members who've betrayed me won't help your situation. You should focus on fixing yourself instead of spreading lies." Margaret had apparently had me followed, or had followed me herself, to my meeting. I stared at the photo, feeling a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just about control anymore, it was about surveillance and intimidation. Margaret was escalating beyond morning invasions and family interventions into something darker and more sinister. The woman who claimed to just want to help had hired someone, or taken time to follow me around town documenting my movements. I forwarded the photo to my attorney friend with a message asking if this constituted harassment or stalking. Her response was immediate and concerning. She advised me to document everything, including the photo and message, and to consider filing a police report. This kind of behavior often escalated, she warned, and I needed a paper trail in case things got worse, which, given the pattern, they almost certainly would. Daniel appeared in my office doorway holding the paint samples and looking annoyed. "Mum's leaving and you didn't even say goodbye," he said accusingly. "She spent another entire day trying to help us and you can't even show basic courtesy. I don't know what's wrong with you lately, but this needs to stop. She's starting to think you actually hate her, which is ridiculous after everything she's done." I turned my phone screen toward him, showing the photo of me at the coffee shop and the threatening message. His face went through several expressions before settling on defensive disbelief. "That's not Mum," he said immediately without even looking closely. "Someone's playing a prank or you're making this up to make her look bad. Mum would never do something like that. You're being paranoid, and honestly, it's concerning." Even when I showed him it came from her phone number, he had excuses. Someone must have borrowed her phone, or I'd misunderstood the message, or maybe I'd done something to deserve being checked up on. The mental gymnastics he performed to avoid acknowledging his mother's disturbing behavior would have been impressive if they weren't so pathetic. He'd rather believe I was lying or crazy than accept that his mother was stalking me. That night, Daniel slept in the guest room again, but I heard him on the phone with Margaret for hours. Their murmured conversation drifted through the walls, punctuated occasionally by his reassurances that he understood and would handle it. The phrase "she's getting worse" appeared multiple times, along with discussions about my mental state and whether I needed professional help. They were building a case that I was unstable, just like Sarah had warned. The next morning, Margaret arrived with reinforcements. Daniel's sisters Ellen and Patricia accompanied her, each carrying cleaning supplies and wearing matching aprons with "property of a godly woman" embroidered on the front. They announced they'd be deep cleaning the house since I'd clearly been neglecting my duties. And Daniel deserved better than living in what Ellen called squalor, despite the house being perfectly clean. I watched them spread through my home like an invasive species, examining everything and finding it wanting. Patricia actually ran her finger along the top of picture frames, checking for dust, while Ellen inspected the inside of the refrigerator and made disapproving sounds about my organization. Margaret supervised the operation, making notes on a clipboard about areas needing special attention and items that should be thrown away or replaced. They worked systematically through each room, discussing my failures loud enough to ensure I heard every word. The bathroom grout needed resealing because I'd failed to maintain it properly. The guest room sheets weren't folded correctly in the linen closet. The kitchen pantry was organized all wrong, with items placed according to how I cooked rather than Margaret's approved system. Every critique was delivered with theatrical disappointment. When they reached my office door and found it locked, Margaret actually called Daniel at work to complain. I heard her side of the conversation, telling him I was hiding things and acting suspiciously by locking doors in my own home. She suggested maybe I was having an affair or involved in something shameful that I didn't want the family to discover. The seed of doubt was planted deliberately and with calculation. Daniel texted me immediately, demanding I unlock my office so his mother and sisters could clean properly. When I refused, explaining it contained sensitive work documents, he called me directly. His voice was cold and suspicious as he asked what I was really hiding. The fact that I might want privacy in my own home never occurred to him, or if it did, he'd decided I didn't deserve it anymore. The cleaning crew finally left after 6 hours, having reorganized everything according to Margaret's specifications. They'd thrown away several of my personal items, including coffee mugs from places I'd travelled, claiming they were mismatched, and cluttering the kitchen. My favourite throw pillow was gone because the colour didn't fit their beige aesthetic. Even my shower products had been replaced with brands Margaret approved of. I found Ellen in my bathroom actually photographing my medicine cabinet contents before she noticed me watching. When I demanded to know what she was doing, she said Margaret wanted to make sure I wasn't taking anything dangerous that might explain my recent behaviour. The violation of privacy was so complete I felt physically sick. These people were documenting my life, looking for evidence to use against me in their campaign to prove I was an unfit wife. That evening, Daniel came home with a small suitcase, which he placed by the front door. He announced he'd be staying with his mother for a few days to give me time to think about my behaviour and decide what kind of marriage I wanted. The ultimatum was clear: submit to Margaret's control or lose my husband. He'd already chosen his side and was just waiting for me to either surrender or leave. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and delivered what he clearly thought was a loving speech about marriage and family. He talked about how his parents had been married for 40 years because his mother understood her role and never challenged the family structure. He said I could have that same happiness if I just stopped fighting against the people trying to help me. His mother only wanted what was best for both of us, and my pride was destroying our chance at a beautiful life. The house felt different after he left. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling watched or judged. I walked through each room, seeing Margaret's influence everywhere, from the labelled cabinets to the beige pillows she'd replaced mine with. This wasn't my home anymore. It was an extension of her domain with me as an unwelcome guest she was trying to evict through psychological warfare. I spent the evening creating a detailed timeline of events starting from our wedding day. Every incident, every criticism, every boundary violation went into a document that grew longer with each memory. What emerged was a clear pattern of escalation, from subtle undermining to open hostility. Margaret had been patient at first, confident that she could mold me into her vision of a proper wife. When that failed, she'd moved to more aggressive tactics. My attorney friend called after reviewing everything I'd sent. She advised me to start protecting myself immediately, change passwords on all accounts, document any shared assets, and consider opening a separate bank account. She'd seen situations like this turn ugly quickly when the controlling family realized they were losing. Margaret had already shown she was willing to stalk and harass me. It would likely get worse before it got better. That night, I made my decision. I would not become another Jennifer driven out in defeat after being systematically destroyed by Margaret's campaign, but I also wouldn't stay and fight for a marriage that existed only in my imagination. The man I'd fallen in love with had either never existed or had been so thoroughly reprogrammed by his mother that he was lost to me. Either way, I deserved better than being the enemy in my own life. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No key in the lock, no Margaret in my kitchen, no judgment about my breakfast choices. I made coffee in one of my remaining travel mugs and sat at my kitchen table making plans. I would need to be strategic about leaving gathering resources and support before making my move. Margaret might have won this battle, but she wouldn't get the satisfaction of destroying me completely. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel asking if I'd had time to reflect on my behaviour. He said his mother was willing to forgive everything if I showed genuine remorse and committed to following her guidance going forward. The generous offer came with conditions including weekly meetings with Pastor Williams, attending the submission support group, and giving Margaret complete access to our home at all times. I didn't respond. Instead, I called the apartment complex I'd been researching and scheduled viewings for 3 units that afternoon. The leasing agent was friendly and professional, showing me spaces that were small but bright, with no room for mothers-in-law to invade. I stood on the balcony of the corner unit imagining morning coffee without dread, evening dinners without criticism, and weekends that belonged to me alone. On my drive home, I noticed a familiar car following me. Margaret's beige sedan stayed exactly 2 cars behind me through every turn and lane change. When I stopped at a grocery store, she pulled into the parking lot and waited. I went inside and wandered the aisles for 30 minutes, testing whether she'd stay. When I finally emerged with a single bag, she was still there, watching from across the lot. I drove home with her, following the entire way. She didn't try to hide it anymore, confident that Daniel would support whatever she did in the name of protecting him from his unsuitable wife. When I pulled into my driveway, she parked across the street and sat there watching. I went inside and closed all the curtains, but I could feel her presence like a weight pressing against the walls of the house. This was my life now, under constant surveillance by a woman who'd appointed herself judge and jury of my worth as a wife. Every move I made would be reported to Daniel as evidence of my instability or infidelity or whatever narrative Margaret was spinning that day. The psychological pressure was intended to break me, to make me either submit completely or run away in defeat. What she didn't understand was that she was actually making my decision easier. That evening, Daniel called to inform me that Margaret had seen me looking at apartments. His voice was hurt and accusing as he demanded to know why I was planning to leave when he'd given me a chance to fix things. The fact that his mother had spent the day stalking me didn't bother him at all. In his mind, she was protecting their family from a threat, and that threat was me. I told him calmly that I was exploring options since he'd moved out and given me ultimatums about our marriage. He sputtered and said he'd only left temporarily to give me space to come to my senses. The circular logic was exhausting. I was wrong for not accepting his mother's control, but also wrong for making plans when he'd essentially abandoned me for not accepting his mother's control. No matter what I did, I would be the villain in their story. The next few days followed the same pattern. Margaret parked outside my house for hours, documenting when I left and returned. She followed me to work, to the gym, to meet friends, always staying just far enough away to claim coincidence if confronted. My colleagues began noticing the beige sedan in our parking lot, and security eventually asked if I needed assistance with what appeared to be a stalking situation. I started receiving emails from Daniel with links to articles about mental health facilities that specialized in treating women with personality disorders. The subject line said things like, "This might help," and options for getting better. He'd apparently decided I was mentally ill because no sane woman would reject his mother's love and guidance. It was easier to pathologize me than examine his own family's toxic dynamics. My breaking point came on a Friday afternoon. I arrived home to find Margaret inside my house with 2 men in coveralls. They were dismantling my home office under her direction, removing my desk and bookshelves, while she explained that the room would be better used as a nursery for future grandchildren. My personal belongings were being stuffed into boxes without care, including client files and work materials. I called the police immediately, reporting a break-in and theft in progress. Margaret's face went from smug satisfaction to shock when the officers arrived. She tried to explain that she was family and had a key, but the officers informed her that entering someone's home without permission and removing their property was still illegal, regardless of familial relationship. They made the movers return everything while Margaret called Daniel frantically. Daniel arrived as the police were taking my statement. He immediately began defending his mother, saying this was all a misunderstanding, and I was overreacting to a generous gesture. The officers looked skeptical as he tried to explain why his mother dismantling my office without permission was actually helpful. They suggested strongly that Margaret return her key and refrain from entering the property without explicit invitation from both homeowners. The humiliation of being corrected by police officers in front of neighbours who'd gathered to watch the drama unfold was too much for Margaret. She began sobbing dramatically about being treated like a criminal when all she'd ever done was love too much. Daniel comforted her while shooting me looks of pure hatred, In his mind, I'd now publicly humiliated his mother and crossed an unforgivable line. After everyone left, Daniel stood in our driveway and delivered his final ultimatum. Either I apologized to his mother publicly and accepted her complete authority in our lives, or he would file for divorce. The choice was mine, but he was done trying to help someone who clearly didn't want to be part of his family. He gave me 24 hours to decide before driving away with Margaret, following in her beige sedan. I spent that night packing, not everything, just the essentials and items that were mine before the marriage. I arranged for movers to come the next week for the rest after I'd found a permanent place. The relief I felt was overwhelming. The constant anxiety of living under siege was ending. Margaret had won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. She'd get her son back, but he'd be the same man-child he'd always been unable to function without her. The next morning, I left my wedding rings on the kitchen counter with a note that simply said, "I choose myself." I didn't elaborate or explain or justify. They wouldn't understand anyway. In their minds, I would always be the ungrateful wife who'd rejected love and chosen selfishness over family. Let them have their narrative. I had my freedom, and that was worth more than their approval would ever be. I drove away as the sun was rising with my car full of boxes and hope for the first time in months. In my rearview mirror, I saw Margaret's beige sedan parked in its usual spot across from my house. She was probably waiting to document my shameful departure, adding it to her collection of evidence that I was unsuitable. I smiled and kept driving toward my new life where breakfast could be anything I wanted, and no one would ever call me ungrateful for existing in my own space. 6 months later, I received divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences and abandonment. Daniel was requesting I pay alimony since apparently his mother had convinced him he was traumatized by my cruelty and unable to work at full capacity. I forwarded everything to my attorney, who laughed at the audacity and filed a counterclaim. The man who'd lived with his mother rather than set boundaries wanted me to financially support his chosen dependents. The divorce proceedings were brutal, with Margaret appearing at every meeting to support her wounded son. She'd created a binder of evidence against me, including photos from her surveillance and documentation of every perceived slight. The judge seemed unimpressed by her presentation, especially when my attorney presented evidence of stalking and harassment. The final settlement was fair, and I walked away cleanly from the marriage that had become a prison. I learned later through Sarah that Daniel had moved back into his childhood bedroom permanently. Margaret had converted it into a shrine to his preferences with the same sports posters from high school and his mother doing his laundry and cooking his meals. At 34 years old, he'd returned to the womb unwilling or unable to exist as an independent adult. Margaret finally had what she'd always wanted her baby boy all to herself, with no pesky wife trying to make him grow up. Meanwhile, I thrived in my new apartment and eventual promotion at work. I dated cautiously, but eventually met someone whose mother lived 3 states away and believed healthy boundaries were essential for adult relationships. When she visited, she stayed in a hotel and called before coming over. She treated me like an autonomous adult, capable of taking care of her son without detailed instruction manuals. The contrast was refreshing and healing. Sometimes I think about the woman I was in that beige kitchen, being told I couldn't cook eggs properly by someone who believed love meant control. I want to go back and tell her it's okay to leave, that staying doesn't make you strong and fighting doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is recognize when a battle isn't worth fighting and choose yourself instead. But I couldn't save that version of me any more than Sarah could save Jennifer. What I can do is share my story with women who might be sitting in their own kitchens right now wondering if they're crazy for wanting basic respect and autonomy in their marriages. You're not crazy or ungrateful or difficult. You're a human being who deserves a partner, not a supervisor, and a mother-in-law who understands that her job ended when her son became an adult. If the people in your life can't see that the problem isn't with you, Margaret still sends Christmas cards to my office addressed to Mrs. Daniel Thompson, like I'm forever defined by a marriage that ended years ago. I throw them away unopened and go home to my peaceful life where eggs can be cooked any way I please, and no one has a key except me. It's a smaller life in some ways, but it's entirely mine, and that makes it bigger than any mansion where I'm treated as an incompetent guest. Freedom is its own kind of wealth, and I'm richer now than I ever was as Daniel's wife.